Good evening, comrade. Thank you for joining us tonight with Roger Silverman again. We're having a look at the Second International, Marxism and the Second International. You'll remember 2 weeks ago, the comrade presented a session on the First International, described the struggles between Marx and the anarchists and how the International collapsed because of counter-revolutionary period that was entered at the time. So tonight we're looking at the Second International, those struggles in the setting up of it, and then also why it collapsed and perhaps what lessons we can draw from it. Thank you very much, Roger, for joining us again.
Okay, thank you. Well, as Tina said, last week we examined the brief but spectacular history of the International Working Men's Association, the world's first workers' international. History has seen many times the rise and fall of magnificent international organizations of the working class, in harmony with the ebb and flow of the class struggle itself. On the eve of every great social explosion, as the workers have flexed their muscles for a renewed assault on capitalist rule, new political formations have come into existence. And as the tide ebbed, as the revolution receded and reaction set in, these have been dashed against the rocks of the counter-revolution and shattered. But not even the most terrible defeats or the most disorientating intervals in the struggle have yet succeeded in obliterating completely the traditions of scientific socialism. A thin line of conscious cadres, if only a tiny handful, isolated sometimes to a single country, have always survived, around whom mass parties came to be created once the tide turned and the old society fell prey to crisis. The ideas of socialism and, of course, internationalism were not foisted artificially on the workers by Marxists. They sprang out of the aspirations of the working class, thrown together without property and dependent for their survival on solidarity and struggle. The IWMA had been a worldwide ideological workshop in which all the rival ideas could be tested out in practice against the experiences of the workers, both in victory and in defeat. And as Engels had explained, the aim of the International had been, quote, to weld together into one huge army the whole militant working class of Europe and America. And therefore, he went on, it could not set out from the principles laid down in the Communist Manifesto. In other words, it was a forum in which to debate the issues, a foundry in which to sharpen the political tools. Now, the IWMA itself was destroyed by the defeat of the Paris Commune, leaving the workers without a battle headquarters, an arena of debate, or a coordinating center serving their needs as an international class. But it is a stunning tribute to Marx and Engels that they had already won the argument. It took the defeat of the Paris Commune, but their brilliant analysis of its lessons was written in the collective name of the General Council. As Engels had predicted on the collapse of that body, I believe the next International will be directly communist and will proclaim precisely our principles. And so it proved, and sooner than could have been expected. The effectiveness of their work was proved by the fact that over the 7 short years of existence of the IWMA, by the time it was forced to shut down, they had succeeded in establishing first principles. So once the tide had turned and newly emergent mass parties and trade unions had taken root, a new International was founded in 1889, and it stood under the banner of the ideas of the Communist Manifesto. So, at least nominally, on the ideas of scientific socialism, of Marxism. Now, what an achievement that was. Marx and Engels had succeeded almost single-handedly in establishing the authority of their method. Sorry, 1 second. As the standpoint of the working class. Who today has heard of the social quacks with their universal panaceas, the Proudhons and the Durings, the Lassalles, Bakunins and Bronckis? And today, a century and a half later, how many millions around the world have at least dimly heard the name of Karl Marx? So with the feverish growth of capitalism and of the proletariat, great mass workers' parties were built during the 1870s and 1880s, mostly proclaiming themselves Marxists. In the 1870s, social democratic parties were established in Germany, Austria, Denmark, France, Holland, Hungary, Spain, Switzerland, and the USA. And then in the 1880s, in Belgium, Britain, Norway, Russia, and Sweden. When the founding Congress of the Second International was held in July 1889, they chose that as a symbolic date, deliberately chosen because it was the centenary of the French Revolution. And as Engels had predicted, it stood at least formally on the basis of Marxist ideas. Delegates representing fledgling workers' parties in 24 countries gathered in Paris together under a massive red banner carrying the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." 467 delegates were gathered there to hear its chair announce, quote, "one of the greatest events in the history of the peoples." Marx's son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, welcomed them with the words, "We gather here, not under the banner of the tricolour or any other national colours. We gather here under the banner of the red flag, the flag of the international proletariat." And when the new organisation proclaimed May the 1st, 1890, as the occasion for a world one-day general strike, that first act of the Socialist International opened a new era in world history. The ruling class was thrown into panic throughout Europe, and in many countries it met the strike with brutality. And on that momentous May Day, Engels celebrated with pride the triumphant consummation of the historic life work of himself and Marx, and he wrote with pride, "True, the International itself lived only 9 years, but that the eternal union of the proletarians of all countries created by it is still alive and lives stronger than ever, there is no better witness than this day. Because today, as I write these lines, the European and American proletariat is reviewing its fighting forces, mobilized for the first time, mobilized as one army under one flag for one immediate aim. And today's spectacle will open the eyes of the capitalists and landlords of all countries to the fact that today the working men of all countries are united indeed." And then he ended by saying, "If only Marx was still by my side to see this with his own eyes." Engels, of course, could not have foreseen the betrayals and defeats that were still to come. Now, the new workers' parties that were now springing up in Europe gained enormous influence, and especially so in Germany. By 1905, the German Social Democratic Party already had 384,327 members, and by 1914, party membership had swelled to 1,085,905. In 1912, the SPD won 4.3 million votes out of 12.2 million, and it had over 1 million members, with 2.5 million in affiliated trade unions. It offered workers not only a political voice, but also welfare and cultural services, including legal aid, social security advice, employment exchanges, drama productions, libraries, peripatetic teachers, choral societies, sports clubs, welfare clinics, holiday packages, rallies, festivals, training courses, a central school for workers' education, and a famous party school. It published a number of weekly and monthly periodicals, and even its own press agency. In fact, it published 91 newspapers with a total readership of 1.5 million. It ran successful Marxist education classes at party schools and trade union colleges, and it became a model for socialist parties throughout Europe. However, deep within it, the hidden cancer was already incipient even from the start. It was ominous that at the founding conference, the German section announced that it would only observe the May Day demonstration in the evening after working hours, and the British that it would hold a march, but it would be on the first Sunday in May rather than strike on a working day. And more serious still, a few years later, was the dishonest treatment of Engels's famous introduction to Marx's class struggles in France, where he had made a brilliant analysis of the military and political changes in the tasks facing the proletariat since the days of barricades fighting in 1848. It was published, but with a key passage excluded, thus distorting the whole meaning of the article to justify the opportunist policies of the right wing under Bernstein, who we'll come into in a moment. And from his deathbed, Engels protested that, quote, "I am made to appear a pacific worshipper of legality at any price." And he demanded a correction, quote, "in order that this shameful impression be wiped out." But it was not actually until 1924 that the excluded passage was rediscovered. And it was to the credit of revolutionaries like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg that they were not at all disorientated or blown off course by the use against them of such a gigantic authority as Engels. This monstrous fabrication, although it was 1,000 times excelled since then by the Socialists, in comparison with which Bernstein looks like a clumsy amateur, but it was not the first of its kind. If comrades would go back a little further, Marx's own critique of the Gotha program, which corrected the mistakes in the draft program around which Germany's two socialist workers' parties were uniting, was itself suppressed for 16 years, from 1875 to 1891. So throughout a protracted period of economic upswing, strong reformist tendencies developed around the labour bureaucracy, crystallizing in the new imperialist epoch. It was a period similar in its corrosive effects on the political level of the labour movement to the decades following the Second World War, from which we have at last emerged in the recent period. The reformist ideas of Bernstein, of the British Fabians, of Millerand in France, the first socialists to enter a bourgeois cabinet, were eventually to culminate in the great betrayal of 1914, though such a catastrophic nightmare outcome was utterly unthinkable to everyone at the time. The first prophet of reformism, Bernstein, pioneered the term revisionism, opposing the idea that the lot of workers under capitalism was deteriorating and that capitalism was heading for a catastrophic collapse. And he argued that the party should be a democratic socialist party of reform. The so-called party centre, led by Kautsky, held up their hands in horror. Formally, they upheld the banner of orthodox Marxism, but in practice it adopted a passive, abstract and sterile attitude of holiday speechifying. Now, Marxism claimed he was trying to make Marxism conform to reality. In fact, it was a plausible theory at the time, though it's been repeated many times since with decreasing plausibility. But Marx's prediction about the impoverishment of the working class had been apparently falsified by the continuing rise in their standard of living. So his theory of the inevitable collapse of capitalism, Bernstein argued, was falsified by capitalism's continuing expansion and strength over a whole historical period. For several decades, there have been more or less smooth development of the economy and no major wars. So therefore, he said that the theory of the inevitable collapse of capitalism was made redundant by capitalism's continuing expansion and strength. And what Bernstein argued was, quote, "What is generally referred to as the ultimate aim of socialism means nothing to me. It is the movement itself which means everything." In other words, the struggle for reforms was the pinnacle of what could be achieved by the labour movement. Now, this ideology, as I said, was widely shunned as a heresy, but it could be regarded as only a more explicit and transparent manifestation of the actual practice of the orthodox leadership of the International. Because the Socialist International went through a period when its leaders, Kautsky and Bebel, continued to defend Marxism in words against this growing reformist trend led by Bernstein, representing a rising generation of party careerists. But in practice, they paid only perfunctory lip service to Marxism, while in practice pursuing day by day moderate practical goals. It was an early manifestation of centrism, a stance midway between reform and revolution. Now, of course, there was also a very vigorous left wing within the German social democracy. The militant left wing was led by such towering figures as, of course, Rosa Luxemburg, but also Mehring, Jugiches, Karski, Radek, Clara Zetkin, and soon joined by the younger Liebknecht Karl. Rosa Luxemburg's life, let's just take a moment to reflect on that. It represents a perfect combination of theory and practice, and in that she created classic Marxist literature and at the same time threw herself body and soul into the struggles of working people. She was a gigantic presence in the labor movements of Poland and Russia and Germany. It was Rosa Luxemburg, being closer to the fray of the intimate inner party debates in the German party, who had proved most alert to the coming danger. And yet, together with her comrade Karl Liebknecht, she too had underestimated the mortal threat posed by the tendency of Kautsky and the leadership to accommodate and to conciliate the reformist wing. And like so many great revolutionaries, in her lifetime, Rosa Luxemburg was reviled, slandered, exiled, jailed, and of course, soon murdered. And after her death, she became transformed, as so many others have, into a harmless icon, her role grossly distorted and misrepresented as a supposed enemy of the Russian Revolution. Of course, it's true that she expressed secondary theoretical differences with aspects of Marx's economic theories and some practical objections to aspects of the Bolsheviks' practice. But these were products of that fertile, creative spirit which is common to all genuine revolutionaries. Rosa Luxemburg honorably upheld the spirit of party democracy, as did Trotsky. And I would like to give one quote from Rosa. Marxism does not consist of a dozen persons who have granted each other the right to be the experts, before whom the masses are supposed to prostrate themselves in blind obedience, like loyal followers of the true faith of Islam. Marxism is a revolutionary outlook on the world that must always strive towards new knowledge and new discoveries. Its living force is best preserved in the intellectual clash of self-criticism and in the midst of history's thunder and lightning. Those are golden words, which of course are well remembered by many people in many situations since that time. And of course, she talked about history's thunder and lightning. Rosa was to see plenty of thunder and lightning before falling victim as a martyr to the murderers of the pre-fascist Freikorps. Now, where did Lenin and the Bolsheviks stand along this spectrum? Did they represent, as they are often portrayed, an alien tendency? Far from the commonly accepted caricature, painting them as bloodthirsty fanatics hell-bent on civil war, they consider themselves nothing more than orthodox mainstream socialists. They were representing the traditions of Marx and Engels against what was generally accepted as the deviant rebel strand of Bernsteinian reformism. The name Bolsheviks, of course, which meant the majority faction within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, that party was simply the Russian counterpart to the social democratic parties of Western Europe. And as its leading figure, Lenin considered himself nothing more than the local counterpart on Russian soil of Babel and Kautsky in combating these reformist heresies. And again, I'd like to give a longish quote from Trotsky, because it's important to put in context the role of Lenin in this struggle. Trotsky says, Kautsky at the time was to be found fighting against Bernstein. Lenin considered Kautsky as his teacher, and he stressed this everywhere he could. In Lenin's work of that period, and for a number of years following, one doesn't find even a trace of criticism in principle directed against the Babel-Kautsky tendency. Instead, one finds a series of declarations to the effect that Bolshevism is not some sort of an independent tendency, but is only a translation into the language of Russian conditions of the tendency of Babel-Kautsky. And Trotsky went on, Lenin wrote in his famous pamphlet, Two Tactics, in the middle of 1905, when and where did I ever call the revolutionism of Babel and Kautsky opportunism? When and where have there been brought to light differences between me on the one hand and Babel and Kautsky on the other? The complete unanimity of international revolutionary social democracy on all major questions of program and tactics is a most incontrovertible fact. Now, as Trotsky said, Lenin's words are so clear, precise, and categorical as to entirely exhaust the question. And just one more quote from Lenin in December 1906. We are not creating a special Bolshevik tendency. Always and everywhere, we merely uphold the point of view of revolutionary social democracy. And again, in Trotsky's words, Lenin compared the Mensheviks not with Kautskyism, but with revisionism. Moreover, he looked upon Bolshevism as the Russian form of Kautskyism, which in his eyes was in that period identical with Marxism. Now that, of course, changed very, very, very sharply. That explains the especially intense outrage with which Lenin fulminated against Kautsky's later overt disdain for revolutionary policies and demolished his arguments, for instance, in State and Revolution. But Lenin had, at that point, trusted the leadership of the International. He was shocked to the core by their betrayal of 1914. But he had prepared the way for the tasks of the future by building a disciplined structure capable of withstanding the coming shocks. Now, no one is immune from mistakes. They play an indispensable and essential role in scientific progress, and if anything, even more so in scientific socialism. Up to the outbreak of revolution in 1917, the formula of Lenin and the Bolsheviks was incomplete, algebraic, as Trotsky put it, on the tasks and goals of the Russian proletariat. That's a matter for a future discussion, which I think we're coming to very soon. Trotsky's formulation, the permanent revolution, was to prove more accurate. And yet Trotsky nevertheless recognized without hesitation his mistake in remaining detached from the Bolshevik wing of the party. Like Luxemburg, he had not anticipated the catastrophic historic consequences that were to blight future generations of what still remained mere inter-party theoretical debates. And one more quotation from Trotsky, when he was really explaining how he came to make that mistake, and it applies equally to Rosa Luxemburg. Trotsky said, "Revolutionary centralism is a harsh, imperative, and exacting principle. I thought of myself as a centralist, but there is no doubt that at that time, that is the time of the 1903 split with the Mensheviks, I did not fully realize what an intense and imperialist centralism the Revolutionary Party would need to lead millions of people in a war against the old order. Independently, I still couldn't see Lenin's centralism," he said, "as the logical conclusion of a clear revolutionary concept. In the midst of the still vague moods that were common in the group that upheld the Iskra banner, Lenin alone, and with finality, envisaged tomorrow, with all its stern tasks, its cruel conflicts, and countless victims." So, going back to the Second International, suddenly in August 1914, out of a clear blue sky, the terrible 20th century suddenly exploded all around them. As late as November 1912, as the storm clouds of the coming World War were gathering, 550 delegates from 23 countries had assembled at an extraordinary International Socialist Congress at Basel, where the Socialist International unanimously warned the ruling classes of Europe. "Let the governments remember," they said, "that they cannot unleash a war without danger to themselves. Let them remember that the Franco-German War was followed by the revolutionary outbreak of the Commune, that the Russo-Japanese War set into motion the revolutionary energies of the peoples of the Russian Empire, that the competition in military and naval armaments gave the class conflicts in England and on the continent an unheard of sharpness, and unleashed an enormous wave of strikes. It would be insanity for the governments not to realize that the very idea of the monstrosity of a world war would inevitably call forth the indignation and the revolt of the working class. The proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the profits of the capitalists, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties." Now that, if you like, was a warning to the ruling class. Be careful. If you go to war, what mayhem could be unleashed. But in a way, they still did not actually believe that such an outcome was likely. By now, the Socialist International constituted a formidable force. Its membership, if you take just the four main belligerent countries in the war, Germany, Britain, Austria, and France, its membership in those 4 countries alone amounted to, in Germany, 1 million plus, in Britain, 1.5 million plus, in Austria, 150,000, in France, 90,000, in fact, totaling not far short of 3 million organized members. The total votes for these 4 parties alone in recent elections amounted to over 7 million. It would have taken a single, bold, united call for millions to have been rallied to the cause of peace and solidarity. But the Socialist Party leaders had largely discounted any serious threat of world war. As they put it, it would be insanity without recognizing the insanity of capitalism. The Austrian socialist leader Adler, for instance, commented, if such a crime were committed, it would be the beginning of the end for the criminal's own power. The French leader Jaurès, who was assassinated on the very eve of the war, reminded the governments that, quote, in conjuring up the danger of war, they invite the peoples to make a simple calculation. How much smaller a sacrifice a revolution would involve when compared with the war that they are preparing. So the final statement of the Socialist International at a special conference, that special conference in Basel, while remaining formally speaking consistent with the earlier Stuttgart resolution, which I hadn't mentioned, but which was a more clear warning in the earlier years, but it shrank from the rhetoric of its ringing declaration. It just reminded the ruling powers that they should not forget, quote, that they would be unable to start a war without endangering their own position. It would be madness for governments to lose sight of the fact that the very prospect of such an abomination as a world war would be enough to provoke the indignant hostility of the workers and drive them to revolt. Let the capitalist world of exploitation and mass murder be confronted by the proletarian world of peace and international brotherhood. Now, despite the ringing resolutions, with the ink hardly dry on their declaration, again, that the proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the benefit of the capitalist profits, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties. When it came to the issue, the British Labour Party entered the war government, the Belgian and French socialists joined coalition governments, the Australian Labour government supported the war, and of course, the German, along with the Austrian and the South African socialists, supported their governments. The International was shattered. Only the Independent Labour Party, some Russian Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, and Kautsky gave half-hearted opposition to the war, but of course it was left to the Bolsheviks, the Spartacists in Germany, and a handful of Eastern European allies to maintain revolutionary opposition to the war. Once war had been declared, as I said, practically every one of the leaders of the socialist parties had crumbled and capitulated miserably to their kings and generals. Victor Adler of Austria wrung his hands. The war is already with us. There is nothing further we can do. The German party spokesperson justified, this is his speech actually in the Reichstag at the time. He justified supporting the Kaiser's war credits on 4th of August 1914 with this little speech. We are faced now with the iron fact of war. We're threatened with the horrors of hostile invasions. We don't decide today for or against war. We have merely to decide on the necessary means for the defense of the country. Much, if not everything, is at stake for our people and their freedom, in view of the possibility of a victory of Russian despotism, which has soiled itself with the blood of the best of its own people. It is for us to ward off this danger. In the hour of danger, we shall not desert our fatherland. We feel ourselves in agreement with the International, which has always recognized the right of every nation to national independence and self-defense. As soon as the aim of security has been achieved and the opponents show themselves ready for peace, this war should be ended by a peace which makes it possible to live in friendship with neighboring countries. Guided by these principles, we shall vote for the war credits. After less than 2 years then, all the ringing promises of a Europe-wide general strike against the impending imperialist war were thrown into the dustbin. And almost to the last, the Social Democrats of all the belligerent countries swallowed their speechifying and tamely swung into support behind their kings, generals and ministers, tamely voting war credits to the Kaiser and the other respective combatants. And the news of this capitulation an outright violation of this solemn and unanimous pledge still ringing in their ears, came as an utter shock even to those who had been most critical of the socialist leaders. The capitulation of the German social democracy on that day, August the 4th, was absolutely and entirely unexpected. Lenin, for one, was incredulous. The issue of Vorwärts, the German social democratic newspaper, containing the patriotic declaration of the social democratic faction, was taken by Lenin to be a forgery perpetrated by the German General Staff, and he assumed that the newspaper reporting it was a fake. So immediately on the outbreak of war, all the major socialist parties in the belligerent countries had issued statements justifying their support for their respective ruling classes. The war actually effectively split the International not into two factions, but into three. The pro-war parties in the Central Powers, the pro-war parties of the Triple Entente, and the various very few and sparse anti-war parties, which encompass both the pacifist and the revolutionary currents. And it's impossible to find words which do justice to the indescribable dimensions of this betrayal. It was an act of immeasurable cowardice and treachery, directly plunging two successive generations, numbering tens of millions, into the worst horrors of what became in effect a new 30 years war in Europe, blighting and overshadowing all subsequent history. The Socialist International had died on the outbreak of the First World War, when its leaders had abandoned their internationalist speechifying and started cheering their members on in slaughtering one another by the millions on the battlefields of Europe. The workers once again were left without an international at the critical hour. Instead of debating across the floor of a conference hall, they were peppering each other with bullets. Amid the blood and horror of world war and on the eve of a world revolution incomparably greater than that of 1848, they were left leaderless. And once again, in the dark years of the World War, the International existed only in the method and the perspective of a handful of cadres. So summing up the experience of the Second International, Lenin wrote, "The Second International was an international organization of the proletarian movement whose growth was in breadth at the cost of a temporary fall in the revolutionary level, a temporary increase in the strength of opportunism, which in the end led to the disgraceful collapse of this international. It had been, in fact, the very successes, the growing influence and authority of the socialist parties that had blunted and softened their sharp edge. How was it that the Russian labor movement, so much weaker and more isolated than its Central European counterparts, proved so much more capable of rising to the challenge? And I think the answer is its kaleidoscopic ingenuity, its improvisation and flexibility that equipped it for the tasks ahead. And Lenin put it this way: Bolshevism, which had arisen on this granite foundation of theory, went through 15 years of practical history, 1903 to 1917, unequaled anywhere in the world in its wealth of experience. During those 15 years, no other country knew anything even approximating to that revolutionary experience, that rapid and varied succession of different forms of the movement, legal and illegal, peaceful and stormy, underground and open, local circles and mass movements, and parliamentary and terrorist forms. In no other country has there been concentrated in so brief a period such a wealth of forms, shades, and methods of struggle of all classes of modern society, a struggle which matured with exceptional rapidity and assimilated most eagerly and successfully the appropriate last word of American and European political experience. So the workers once again were left without an international at the critical hour. Amid the blood and horror of the World War, and on the eve of a world revolution incomparably greater, as I said, than that of 1848, and on the scale not of a single city, but actually raging throughout the continent, they were left leaderless. Once again, then, in the dark years of the World War, the International existed only in the method and the perspective of a handful of cadres. Yet the cause of the working class will always inevitably reassert itself. Once again, more forcefully and insistently than ever, and far sooner than anyone could imagine, the phoenix was about to rise from the ashes. And that will be the content of the next discussion. Thanks, comrades.